Friends, I call the meeting to order. And the first item today, welcome remarks by Shri K. and Shrivastava, who is the director of the India International Center.
Honorable Dr. Karan Singh, Professor George Heine, Ms. Lalitha Kumaramangalam, Professor Ashis Nandy, Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin, Dr. Anindita Balslev, ladies and gentlemen. India has always believed in the doctrine of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, meaning the world is one family. Since time immemorial, this doctrine has been guiding us in our conduct, attitude towards others. Though the world community has been advocating for world peace, universal fraternity, amity and understanding, but at the same time we find that the nations are getting more and more obsessed with their individual sense of nationalism at the cost of globalism. While all of us should have great feeling and respect for our respective nations, but at the same time we should not gloss over our duties and responsibility to nurturing universal fraternity and brotherhood. In other words, the flame of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam should always be kept lighting. Unfortunately, in the recent years, we are noticing that the definition of nationalism is getting more and more narrow and restricted and is often at odds with globalism. The recent conflict between Ukraine, supported by Western powers, with Russia amply signifies the existing tension and conflict between nationalism and globalism. Keeping this in mind, we at India International Center felt it necessary and important to organize an international conference on creative tensions between nationalism and globalism. The aims and objective of this conference are basically to analyze the causes for the tension existing between nationalism and globalism and to explore as to how a harmonious relationship between the two can be established for the good of the humanity at large. Dr. Karan Singh, a doyen of our literature and culture and a towering personality in the arena of our national life, has been very kind to guide us in this quest. It is at his inspiration that we have organized this very important international conference. On behalf of the IIC and all of us present over here, I extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Karan Singh, who has very kindly agreed to chair the morning session as well as to offer the concluding remarks at the end of the conference. Welcome, sir. Ambassador Shyam, our president, was to be with us at this conference today, but unfortunately, due to his indisposition, he has not been able to join us. He, however, has conveyed his best wishes for the success of this conference. I extend a very warm welcome to Professor George Heine, a renowned academician and a former diplomat. He is currently a research professor at Pardee School of Global Studies and an interim director of the Pardee Center for the Study of Longer Range Future at Boston University. He has served as Chile's ambassador to China, to India, and to South Africa, as well as a cabinet minister in the Chilean government. He has held many other important positions and has authored as many as 17 books relating to diplomacy and other subjects. I extend a very warm welcome to you, Professor. Mrs. Lalitha Kumaramangalam is a very familiar face for the IIC. She comes from a very illustrious political family. She has worked relentlessly for diverse populations like sex workers, LGBTQ community on health empowerment and development. She has also served as chairperson of National Commission for Women and has been responsible for the enactment of surrogacy law, the formulation of Triple Talaq Bill. She has served on boards of several NGOs and is committed to the empowerment of disadvantaged communities. I extend a very, very warm welcome to you, madam. Professor Ashis Nandy, I think he has not yet joined, but he will be joining us shortly. He is a world-renowned political psychologist, sociologist, and futurist. He is an honorary fellow at Center for Study of Developing Societies, a distinguished fellow at the Institute of Post-Colonial Studies, Melbourne. He has been listed among the world's top 100 public intellectuals. Professor Nandy is a very senior member of IIC and he was also a member of IIC Board of Trustees. I extend a welcome to him, though he's not present in absentia, but he will be joining us very shortly. Ambassador Akbaruddin is my dear colleague. I had a good fortune of working with him in the Ministry of External Affairs some years ago. He is a highly distinguished and admired diplomat of our country. His last diplomatic assignment was permanent representative of India to the United Nations during 2016 to 2020. He has served in several Indian missions overseas. After retirement, he has been devoting extensively on global public policy issues and delivering lectures on public policy issues and international relations at various national institutions in the country. I extend a warm welcome to you, Akbar. The moving spirit behind holding this international conference is none other than Professor Anindita Balslev, founder of a Forum for Cross-Cultural Conversation. She has authored a very prestigious book entitled Cross-Cultural Conversation. This book I am referring to, A New Way of Learning, published by Routledge. The third topic of the book is the title of today's international conference. Professor Balslev is a crusader for cross-cultural conversation and promotion of international understanding, amity and fraternity. She is a well-known philosopher. I had several opportunities in the past to interact with her. I can say very proudly that my each conversation with her indeed enriched my understanding of the global community. She abhors otherness outrightly. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome each one of you for being with us today at this conference. I am sure all of us are going to get immensely benefited with the deliberations that are going to take place in various sessions of this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shrivastava. Before I call upon Anindita, I'd like to welcome the speakers of today. There's Ambassador Jorge Heine. That's how it's pronounced. Jorge Heine. Correct?
Okay.
He is a research professor, and he was the Chilean ambassador to India many years ago, and therefore knows our country well. And he's got a very distinguished career. When he's speaking, he'll be introduced. His academic and intellectual achievements. Then we have Lalitha Kumaramangalam, who is the daughter of my very, very dear friend Mohan Kumaramangalam, who was in the cabinet with me. Unfortunately, we lost him in an air crash during the time he was in the cabinet. And I saw Lalitha when she was 3 years old. Now she's a little older than that. But nonetheless, I've known her and the family for a long time. And I welcome her here. She's very active. Ambassador Shamsan, unfortunately, as I said, is not coming. Ambassador Akbaruddin did very well, as if you remember, during the United Nations, when he was our representative there. He made a definite mark on the United Nations. And then we have Ashis Nandy, of course, who will be joining us shortly, hopefully. So that's it. Now, Anindita Balslev. She is MA Columbia, MA Calcutta, PhD Paris in philosophy, founder of this forum, CCC, Cross-Cultural Conversations, a founding member of ISSR, the International Society of Science and Religion. She's organized a number of conferences over the years, many of which I have attended. She's published a large number of books. This one was the result of a Jawaharlal Nehru Fellowship that I had given her, and this book was a result of that. And she's got a number of books, and she's the one really who's been the moving spirit behind this conference. So, Anindita, now you're on. Okay. Tell us about the conference. Whatever you like.
Namaskar. Let me also extend to all of you a very warm welcome to this CCC conference, held in collaboration with the India International Center, on the topic Creative Tensions Between Nationalism and Globalism. I assume that all of you have a copy of this brochure, where there is a small write-up on CCC as well as IIC, but let me nevertheless take a couple of minutes and tell you what this CCC program is all about. CCC is an abbreviation for Cross-Cultural Conversation and intended as an umbrella term. CCC does not designate exclusively a conversation between such large aggregates of cultures for which the conventional practice is to use such nomenclatures as East and West, or North and South with special connotations. As a venture, CCC seeks an open exchange between diverse groups and subgroups located in the center and periphery of any societal scenario, focusing on issues that are of concern to our collective lives. Thus, if it is asked, what is that we are seeking to cross by engaging in cross-cultural conversation, and whom do we expect to meet on the other side? The answer lies in becoming aware of the we and they categories that incessantly appear in multiple socio-historical contexts, implying overtly or covertly a sense of boundary. There are many criteria, such as race, gender, religion, caste, class, ethnicity, nationality, and more, that are employed for the sake of forming groups and subgroups. Indeed, we keep inventing newer criteria, separating us from them with a view to serve various cultural purposes with no malicious intent. However, note that boundary is a metaphor, which can be used both in a soft sense and a hard sense. The soft sense of the metaphor simply indicates that there is a border that enables us to speak of our own distinctness by distinguishing it from others, and allows us to recognize, validate, and even celebrate our differences and diversities. Whereas the metaphor of hard boundary, metaphor of boundary in the hard sense, is not just simply that. It implies a barrier where crossing can be seen, as it were, trespassing. Moreover, records show that hard boundaries between we and they can be manipulated to affect our collective lives in a negative manner, to the extent that these may well become the fulcrum for justifying discriminatory policies, as well as for creating socio-political structures that shape and nurture divisive social behavior. So much for the idea of CCC and the obvious implications for the need to soften some of our hard boundaries. Today's CCC conference looks at some of the crucial consequences of the we and they categories that are sustained by the nation-state system of governance. The eminent speakers present here are free to address any aspect of this system of governance that has a huge impact on the current geopolitical landscape, as well as on the present status of our global institutions. It is perhaps worthwhile to remind ourselves at the very beginning of this one-day-long conference the important observation that was made by the social anthropologist cum philosopher Ernst Gellner. He said, I'm quoting him, "Culture and social organization are universal and perennial. States and nationalisms are not. This is an absolutely central and supremely important fact." End of quote. Indeed, this nation-state system of governance is said to be no more than 300 years old. But as it stands, we are unquestionably living in a time when the we and the categories are most vehemently played out in the name of national identity. All nation states have hard boundaries. We need permission to enter the territory of a nation state to which we don't belong. As an example of how ruthlessly such national hard boundaries can work, even at times of peace. For that, all that we need to do is simply to recall those cases that are regularly reported in the news, when a given nation state denies having any legal or moral responsibility toward those who desperately seek refuge after being driven out from their territory, whether because of persecution, hunger, threat of war, or any other calamity. Usually, we remain complacent. We think that is how it is supposed to be. Until and unless the reports are so gruesome that some of us, if not all of us, begin to consider this question whether these atrocities could have been prevented had the political system in which we live not so blatantly clashed with all human values. How do hard boundaries work when nation states are at war? When the we and they divide is radicalized to its utmost limit? Only recently, we have read about how ancient cities with all their histories and cultures get reduced to rubble in a matter of few days, while dead bodies pile up, and even children are not spared. Either they are made orphans or they are themselves killed. We do believe that any nation state would severely punish an individual for committing even a very minute fraction of such crimes. But then, as the master analyst observed with much cynicism, quote, "The state forbids an individual to do wrong because it wishes to do, not because it wishes to do away with wrongdoing, but because it wishes to monopolize it like salt and tobacco." In his deservingly famous essay, The Disappointment of War, from 1918, Sigmund Freud continues to say, "A state at war makes use of every injustice, every act of violence that would dishonor the individual. It employs not only permissible cunning, but conscious lies and intentional deception against the enemy." Expressed 100 years ago, these critical words have not yet become redundant. Does it sound unlikely that some of these are being enacted somewhere in the global scene as I speak? Let me refer to just one more remarkable essay. This is published in 1917, which also exemplifies a penetrating insight into the nation-state system of governance. While denouncing imperialism and aspiring for every form of upliftment and freedom for his own country, the great visionary poet Tagore had seen through the monstrosities that are possible for a nation-state as an institution to commit, which he described as a perfect organization of power. In his essay, he decried it as being a device that allows, I'm quoting him now, "men who are naturally just be cruelly unjust, both in their act and in their thought, accompanied by feeling they helping the world in receiving its deserts." Needless to say, whom he is referring to? Of course, to the British. Men who are honest can blindly go on robbing others of their human rights for self-aggrandizement, all the while abusing the deprived for not deserving better treatment. He openly said, when this organization of politics and commerce, notice that, state is an organization of politics and commerce, turns into a perfect organization of power, now military is added to it, then it is an evil day for humanity. There are few crimes which it is unable to perpetrate. End of quote. Besides, we know that modern time, the states are getting savvier by the day in implementing such practices with the help of cutting-edge scientific technologies. The nexus between knowledge and power has actually reached an alarming point. Today, a search for a new direction to the dynamics of the self and the other calls for an exploration of the untapped resources across cultures. A mere reiteration of empty political slogans, however lofty sounding, does not enable invention of newer forms of political institutions, nor innovations of new tools of social engagement. CCC is indispensable for a change of mindset. The concern is how to open up a public discourse, too early to call it a collective project, which does not ask us to be disloyal to or call for diminishing a legitimate pride in various forms of our local identities, ethnic, linguistic, religious, etc., but seeks to let emerge a sense of a larger identity by softening the hard boundaries that entitle the national ego to permit the present nation-state system of governance to legitimize its wrongdoings, and especially so when our global organizations seem debilitated. We hear of living in a world, they use such expressions as one world, a global village, of our increasing interconnectedness and interdependence. But what do we witness? We witness fostering of nation-first strategies, encouragement of an arms race, costing an astronomical amount of financial resources that in turn sustain hideously lucrative business opportunities for weapon industries. All these bear witness not only to inconsistencies, but also to a horrendous radicalization of the self and the other. Given the upcoming G20 meeting, which is to take place here in New Delhi, few days from now, India being the rotational president this year, I cannot imagine this CCC conference on the topic, creative tension between nationalism and globalism, to be timelier. While working on this topic, as you have heard from the director and also from Dr. Karan Singh, that the third chapter of my book, Cross-Cultural Conversation, A New Way of Learning, bears the same title as the theme of this conference. When I was working on that, I was curious to know how thinkers in the Western discourse have theorized about the origin of nationalism as a principle for group formation, which eventually led to this remarkable rise and the worldwide acceptance of the nation-state political system. Is it an ideology that has its own intellectual history, or must its origin be traced elsewhere? That was the question that I had in mind. Elie Keduri, on the very first page of his influential book called Nationalism, says, nationalism is a doctrine invented in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. According to him, nationalism's greatest achievement is to enshrine national self-determination as the organizing principle of the international order. However, the rendition regarding what triggered this movement is different from the account that is offered by Ernst Gellner. Gellner claimed that it is due to the socio-economic conditions that were generated, particularly in Europe, from the 18th century onwards. And Keduri says that the rise of nationalism to specific ideologies in the European history of ideas. These are the two. And it's very interesting, we can talk about this later on. Today, a researcher can collect various accounts from divergent sources for the extraordinary reception of this idea of nation-state system of governance around the globe and about its positive as well as negative impact. Look at this. If some have reminded us with reference to historical research, however, how this idea helped the fight against imperialism, colonialism. Remember, it was in the name of nationalism. It's going on. and the resurgence of indigenous culture forms that were suppressed by foreign rulers. Others have pointed out that this system itself is responsible for various forms of exploitation, spread of colonialism, and strengthening of the institution of war, claiming that the records of the two world wars make amply clear the many inherent limitations of this paradigm for achieving global peace. This network of conflicting readings can be expected to provide a crucial challenge to all thinking minds, as no going back is in sight. We cannot suddenly go back to a pre-nation state system situation. At present, there are a little less than 200 nation states. I suppose it's 193 or 195, something like that, registered with the United Nations, an organization whose very origin, history, and problem are especially important for highlighting the tension between nationalism and globalism, and for appreciating not merely the political, but also the ethical dimension of this large concern. Today, nationalism is a full-fledged political category supported by sovereign states, whereas globalism is still, by and large, a moral category backed by global organizations that are often seen as dysfunctional. Why dysfunctional? For one answer to that, while hoping to hear more from the real experts later in the day, let me share with you what I heard Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations and served, I think, for 2 terms, narrated on one occasion. It left a deep impression on me then, precisely because it showed very clearly a root cause of the powerlessness of the UN and the difficulties that it has in adequately responding to the calamities of the international community. Speaking in the context of the time, when the senior President Bush was leaving his office, just about that time, he decided to send American troops to join the United Nations peace mission force that was working in Somalia at that time. A very unfortunate incident happened. Some rebel Somalians had killed, I don't remember the exact number, 16 or 18 American soldiers who were there for this peace mission work. As soon as the TV channels showed the pictures of the dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, there was a huge outcry within US. Consequently, the US government pulled back all the troops from the UN missions work, leaving Somalia in a state of disaster. Here, Kofi Annan added, but the US government stayed on when 2,000 American soldiers were killed out of the 5,000 that were sent to Afghanistan. And then he commented, it's obvious, the way governments perceive their obligations when their national self-interest or national prestige is at stake is very different than what they feel towards as their obligations towards the United Nations. They just don't feel the same responsibility. That was his comment. Evidently, the journey from nationalism to globalism entails attitudinal changes. The way we have cultivated the sentiment of nationalism on a collective level, we have not done so with globalism as yet. Apart from politicians, lawmakers and activists, think of how poets, composers, actors, storytellers, and many others have construed, shaped, and glorified national sentiment, national heroism, and national identity, using all kinds of imaginable cultural artifacts with considerable creative energy, and compare that to what has been done so far to promote globalism. The critical importance of such an enterprise must now sink into our collective consciousness. The best that popular thing that I have heard so far is that song composed by John Lennon, one of the Beatles. Remember that song? Imagine there are no countries, it is not hard to do, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. That was in favor of that. And of course, there are some poems. As members of civil societies, we need to remember the human passion has its elasticity, and the sentiment of nationalism can be manipulated by a nation state, to use a Chomskyan phrase, towards manufacturing public consent, to engage or enter into devastating wars. No matter how one construes it, nationalism can never be a substitute for globalism. As Einstein said, no nation imagines itself coterminous with mankind. No nation is equivalent to that. The account of the Secretary General of the UN, which I shared with you, demonstrates the kind of tension that exists between the institutions that represent nationalism and globalism, between political actions and ethical demands. Do we need some structural changes, political, legal, etc., to enable these institutions to function in harmony? In this connection, I would like to welcome critical discussions today on this concern, as well as on the formation of such regional identities as the European Union, SAARC, and others, and let the speakers tell us whether they see this really as a genuine move towards obtaining a larger identity, transcending just narrow national identities. Today, no matter what changes are taking place in the global geopolitical landscape, we need global institutions that are not vulnerable in the face of national interests of the powerful nation states. Regardless whether the GDP of BRICS has surpassed that of G7, or whichever new alliances of friends and foes are in the horizon of international diplomacy, effective global institutions having the capacity to deal with conflicts, assuming that these are not going to cease anytime soon, will remain indispensable to keep all of us safe and sane. However, it is reassuring to keep in mind that creative thinking often does take place at the time of crisis, especially when the crisis is of such magnitude that no single one or group of nation states, however powerful they may otherwise be, can manage it. If the heads of 20 nation states, representing 65% of the global population and 85% of global GDP, are ready to assemble in the Indian capital, it is certainly indicative, among others, of a keen awareness that the critical challenges that now face us are of such global proportion that these call for cooperation among the nation states. Global initiatives are needed to address such planetary concerns as climate change, pandemics, social justice, search for clean energy, clean water, pollution-free air, stopping soil degradation, and more. The list is long. However, even if G20 is not a primary forum for dealing with international peace and security, we hope that there will be some time to gear discussions in the direction of disarmament. After all, security and finance are not unrelated matters. Competition, fear, and suspicion among nation states encourage investments of obscene amount of intellectual and financial resources for sustaining the institution of war, as well as for the race for increasing the chemical, biological, and nuclear stockpiles of weaponry to match other nations. Reliable sources inform us that what we already have is sufficient to blow up this planet several times over. As I look at the beautiful logo of G20 with the motto of One Earth, One Family, One Future, I rejoice at the thought, perhaps it will be now, that India could champion the cause of globalism. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, or the world as a family, is an ideal that the Indian cultural soil has projected from time immemorial, many, many centuries before the very invention of the nation-state system of governance. This comes in a full text, as you know, with a little bit, there are two versions, with few changes in the words. It says, Ayam bandhor ayam neti ganana laguchetasam udara charitanam tu vasudhaiva kutumbakam. This one is a friend, a relative, and that one is not. So say the petty-minded, the light-hearted. But for those who are magnanimous, the world is a family. This profound ideal, and please note, this is not born of political expediency, but of profound wisdom. It's a call for the change of mindset, a social transformation. It is bad enough that we fail to fulfill even a tiny fraction of that aspiration, but it is worse if we simply seek a borrowed vision of grandeur and self-aggrandizement as a substitute for it. Given that India still is the home for the largest number of poor people on earth, is it not disconcerting to see India listed as a nation state which is one of the biggest purchasers of arms to the tune of billions of dollars? Moreover, this strategy of self-defense seemed to be increasingly seen by many around the globe, although not without reluctance, as not a very effective way to prevent disasters, but rather as indicative of blindly following a suicidal course. On the other hand, it is also evident that let alone an annulment, even a considerable reduction of this practice calls for cooperation among the nation states. No nation state alone can control any longer this unleashing of destructive forces. It would be, of course, really great if during these upcoming G20 meetings, this could be used as a platform for the participating nations, those who are all assembling under the banner of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world as family, adopt a philosophy of globalism for the benefit of all mankind. And among others, there are many planned initiatives, but let them also agree to invest some collective resources for such purposes as innovation of more effective forms of negotiations and better mechanisms that could help sharpen our skills for conflict management and whatever it takes to hinder this abuse of intellectual and economic resources, which is now in the service of arms race. Globalism does not mean surrendering our cultural identities. Note that. Recall that the monolithic versions of national identities of yesteryears of the early 19th century European model, that was often depicting a demographic composition of one race, one language, one religion, etc. It was gradually expanded to comprise various racial, ethnic, linguistic, and religious communities, demonstrating that a common national identity is by no means disruptive of local diversities. Similarly, I think we must now dare to strive for a new cultural acquisition, that of a larger collective identity where our differences that are perceived to be non-negotiable do not get lost but rather are celebrated. How the sentiment of globalism would find expression through economic, political, and diplomatic channels of various nation states, that will of course remain for some time as a work in progress. After all, the metaphor of the world as family inspires a caring, nurturing attitude. The message it conveys is very different from seeing the world as a marketplace, where ruthless transactions go on with the main intent of profiteering, or from looking at the world where we say the world as a battlefield, where the goal entails muscle flexing to intimidate and defeat the other. Speaking of India, it's noteworthy that even in the days of utter subjugation and exploitation of the late 19th century, Indian leaders like Swami Vivekananda never subscribed to any extreme version of right-wing nationalism. He used to say, every nation has a mission of its own, that national union in India must be gathering up of scattered spiritual forces. A nation in India must be a union of those whose hearts beat to the same spiritual tune. That was the attitude. Again, we have also heard the voice of Sri Aurobindo in the middle of the 20th century, who, after having taken part himself in the battle of India's freedom and witnessed its arrival, prophesied that a day would come when nationalism will have fulfilled itself and lost its militancy. It may not be crystal clear yet when that day will come, but unquestionably there does prevail today across cultures a sense of deep despondency about the nation-state system of governance with its insatiable thirst for arms, where distrust trumps our newfound interconnectedness obtained through a common sharing of advanced scientific technology. Peter Singer, a distinguished philosopher currently at Princeton, tells us, it took many voyages to discover that the world is round, and a great feat of technology to bring forth a photograph to show that the world is one. Now the 21st century faces the task of developing a suitable form of government for that single world. It is a daunting moral and intellectual challenge, but one we cannot refuse to take up. Indeed so. Let cross-cultural conversation continue with the intent to soften those hard boundaries that are built into our present political system only to our detriment. Let it continue until our shared deliberations have an impact on the institutional level of our collective lives. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Balslev. You've put forward very eloquently and clearly the importance of cross-cultural conversations. The IIC is an ideal place to have this sort of a conversation, because since we founded this, and I was one of the founder members, it has always been open for free-flowing discussions, total freedom of expression and thought, and the variety of topics, domestic and international, political and economic, intellectual and cultural. Now today's topic, creative tensions, is of much contemporary importance. At the end of the last century, I seem to remember that globalization was becoming the big word. I remember traveling around the world talking about globalization, how that was going to be the next step. And the reason for that was, basically it was the European Union. That was a miracle. We've been traveling in Europe for half a century. Every few miles there was a new country, a new passport, a new word, a new currency. Now suddenly the mark disappeared, the lira disappeared, the franc disappeared, and the EU came into being. And countries that had been at each other's throats for 1,000 years, France, Germany, and Britain, they all became part of one union. Now, that was a very, very extraordinary event. I don't know whether people have really realized the unique nature of what the European Union was. So at that time, we were hoping that what would happen is that we would first of all move into regional groupings, like ASEAN, like SAARC, like NAFTA, and then from there we would move on to some kind of a world order. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. The 21st century has seen a sharp backlash against globalization. Several reasons. There were black swan events. There was President Trump, for example, who was the epitome of a black swan. I mean, who thought that a man like that would get elected as President of the United States? And he immediately denounced globalism. I don't like the word, he said. I'm not interested in globalization. America first. Yes. Very clear. And he withdrew from very important agreements, including even that Paris Agreement he withdrew from and cut off all funding for globalization. And then the United Kingdom's surprise decision to leave the EU. I don't know what possessed them to have that referendum and have that decision. They were doing perfectly well, and then they suddenly decided to pull out, and that weakened the European Union. And then there was, for example, the breakup of Yugoslavia. Now, President Tito I knew very well. I was his Minister of Waiting when he was in India. And one day, we were somewhere a shooting place. I said, I'm not going to go with you. I'm on the side of the animals. You go and shoot. And he got nothing. He said, you must have been praying for the animals. And that evening, he was sitting on a table. He used to smoke those little cigars. He was an extraordinary man, great leader. And as you know, how he developed I don't want to go to his history. He's well known. There's a book called Eastern Approaches by MacLean, who introduced us to Tito. I asked her, I said, Mr. President, I'd like to ask you a question, not as Minister in Waiting, but as a student of political science. In your new constitution, you have provided for secession of the states. Do you think that Yugoslavia will continue after you go? You know what he said to me? He said, Mr. Minister, if after I go the states want to break, let them break. Now this was Tito, mind you, the man who formed Yugoslavia. He realized that even that formation was a fragile formation. And what happened? It broke in a very bad way. Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina and the bombing, it was a terrible event. It wasn't a clean break like Czechs and the Slovaks. I mean, they were very clean and very neat. But this was a terrible breakup. So these were the sort of things that, and now this seemingly unending war between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, what are we talking about globalization? They are the same race, the same religion, the same language, and yet they are at each other's throats. Thousands and thousands have been killed. City after city in Ukraine is collapsed into rubble. I mean, so the point is that I think that the idea of globalization, in fact, has weakened. Now let's face it, the United Nations has failed. Syed Akbaruddin was there for a long time. It has failed. Why has it failed? Because it is frozen in 1945. The victors of the Second World War set up this organization and put themselves in the commanding position of the Security Council. So that as long as the so-called Big Five, and they're no longer the biggest five, there are other ones bigger than them, but they still call themselves the Big Five. The USA, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and China. Now it was first of all the Kuomintang, now it is China. They won't let anybody else come in. Many attempts have been made to reform the United Nations, one formula after the other. They won't, because they won't give up their power. And until they give up their power, the United Nations will never become really relevant. So United Nations failed. However, I would like to make a point. although the United Nations may have failed, many of its specialized agencies have done marvelous work. I'll give you some examples with whom I was directly involved. UNESCO. Now UNESCO, the World Heritage programs, tangible and intangible, is something very, very significant, very important, apart from its educational programs and other cultural programs. There's UNESCO, I've been part of UNESCO for a long time. The World Health Organization. I was Health Minister of India for 5 years, and the WHO is doing marvelous work. Even in this COVID epidemic, the WHO was very important, and they remain a critical factor in the health system of the world. So WHO, IATA, the International Air Travel Association. I was Minister for Aviation, Civil Aviation. Now IATA is a very important organization because now we have millions of people flying all the time. So until you have some organization which can organize international air travel, it will be disaster. So there's another. UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program. Do you recall, all of you, how UNEP began? The first United Nations Conference on the Human Environment was held in Stockholm in 1972, and I was there. I was on the Indian delegation. Indiraji led the Indian delegation. Olof Palme led this. There were only two heads of government were there, and tragically both were assassinated. But for there, that is where it all began. And people talk of Rio plus 2. It's not Rio plus 2. It's Stockholm plus 10 is Rio. Then we should start counting from Stockholm, not from Rio. Rio was, I think, 10 years later or whatever, 5 years later. 20 years later. So अब Rio से लोग कहते हैं Rio plus 2. What about Stockholm? Rio was Stockholm plus 20. And that was when it was first started. And I remember that I had urged Indraji, can't we get UNEP in India? But we had promised it to Africa. And Jomo Kenyatta was a great friend, as you know, he's that legendary leader, Indiraji's friend. So she said, nahi, unko dena. So it was set up in Kenya. It's now in Nairobi. So that is another specialized organization. ILO, the World Labour Organization. So what I'm trying to say is that although the United Nations may have failed, let us not write off the specialized agencies, because they are doing work which cuts across national barriers. All these things that I've mentioned, all of them cut across national barriers. And therefore, in a way, they soften the rigors of absolute nationalism. Because when people have to travel for these purposes, at least they cut across barriers. The doctors know that they can go across, and so on. So this is an important point I want to make. Second point I want to make is that although the United Nations has failed, there are many regional groupings that are now developing. And large numbers of countries. For example, BRICS has 11 members now. G20 has 20 members. EU still has 27 members. ASEAN has 10 members. And BIMSTEC has 7 members. I'm just mentioning some. There may be many more in Africa and Latin America. These regional organizations are tremendously important because they once again bring together people of different races, different countries, different languages in a collective endeavor. So between the specialized agencies and the regional groupings, those are the things I think we should watch. Nationalism is still triumphant, mind you. And I don't quite accept the theory, Anindita, that nationalism was born in the West. Even if you look into our role, for example, the Mahabharata. In Lanka, somebody said to Lakshmana said, why don't we stay here? It's such a beautiful country. He said, Api Swarnamayi Lanka, Name Bhashati Lakshmana, Janani Janma Bhumishcha Swarga Rabi. Although Lanka is very beautiful and golden, and mind you, Lanka was much more prosperous than Ayodhya. Ayodhya was very backward. But he said, although it is so beautiful, I don't like it. Janani Janma Bhumishcha Swargata Vigriyasi. One's homeland is better than heaven. So there were states at that time, then how can we say they were not states, for God's sake? There were many different states in India. The Cholas, for example, created the great states in South India, the Chola kingdom. The Pandyas. I was a Chola in my past life, by the way. Because I love everything from Tamil Nadu. I love the Bharatanatyam. I love the food. I love the Nayanmars. I'm a Shiva Bhakta. Jnana Sambandhar, Appar, Manikavachalam, Nandana, and all of those. I'm very fond. So the Cholas, the Pandyas, and so on, the Vijayanagar Empire. So these were separate states, for God's sake. It was very clear they had their boundaries and they had their this thing. So I don't think that we called it the Westphalian model, because in Westphalia they set up the states in Europe. But maybe in the father of states in Europe, but it was not the father of states around the world. So nation states go back thousands of years. And therefore it's all the more difficult now to overcome them. So, and as Anindita said, there are many areas that just cannot be tackled individually. The COVID pandemic, for example, it cut across all barriers. I mean, those microbes weren't asking which barrier they had to cross, which country they were in. It became worldwide. And everybody was dying. America lost 1 million people with all their healthcare and advancement. 1 million people died in America of COVID. And God knows how many, we claim 500,000 died. Whatever. The point is that in pandemics we are helpless. Individual states cannot. The vaccines, for example, are made here, go around the world. We have sent vaccines, as you know, all to Africa, and I think perhaps to South America also. So that's a part of the international thing. Secondly, as Anindita said, global warming. From that UNEP conference in 1972, when we talked of that, look at what has happened. In our own lifetimes, we've been overcome by global warming. The glaciers are melting. The sea levels are rising. Several countries are going to disappear from the face of the earth, the island countries. Thousands of species are getting extinct. So, how can we deal with that on an individual basis? We have to deal with that collectively. So there are certain areas which do need collective. But whether we will move on to a global society, I'm afraid, I was at one time very optimistic about this, but it seems to me very, very unlikely that it will happen. Very briefly to touch on the philosophical side. Gandhiji, his movement was by no means confined to India. His message was for humanity. It went across also to South Africa, it went to America, civil rights movement, and so on. So Gandhiji's message was also not confined only to India. Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore was actively anti-nationalism. He wrote strong articles, he wrote even a book about nationalism. Not because he wasn't patriotic. You see, we mix up patriotism with nationalism. There's a very subtle distinction. You can be patriotic, you can be proud, but it doesn't mean you've got to be fanatically nationalistic. I think this is something we would like to discuss when the discussion takes place. Is there a difference between nationalism and patriotism? Or are they both words? So Gurudev Tagore, and Sri Aurobindo has rightly been said, he was, even at the end of his life, he was a freedom fighter, and the Bonga Bhanga, and the Bengalis are here, 1905, the Bonga Bhanga, the partition of Bengal by Lord Curzon, and there was the explosion of nationalist fervour. That was when Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Sri Aurobindo, Bipin Chandra Pal, Lala Lajpat Rai, these were the leaders of the Garam group. There was Dadabhai Nauroji and others, they were more moderate, Firoz Shah Mehta, but there was a strong group. Sri Aurobindo left his job in Baroda and went there for 5 years and shone like a meteor. If you read his articles on nationalism now, even now your pulse will increase. But even he, at the end of his life, 1950, he left a message. Luckily, somebody asked for a message from him. He left a message on radio, and he had 5 dreams. I'm only going to read the third dream. The third dream was a world union, forming the outer basis of a fairer, brighter, and nobler life for all mankind. That unification of the human world is underway. There is an imperfect initiation, organized but struggling against tremendous difficulties. But the momentum is there, and inevitably, it must inevitably increase and conquer. Here too, India has begun to play a prominent part, and if she can develop that larger statesmanship, which is not limited by the present facts and immediate possibilities, but looks into the future and brings it nearer, her presence may make all the difference between a slow and timid and a bold and swift development. Now, so this is very dangerous now. A catastrophe may intervene and interrupt or destroy what is being done. This is a very ominous phrase. I think the catastrophe is coming. The way this Ukraine-Russia war is developing is bound to develop into a nuclear conflict, the way it is going. A catastrophe may intervene, he says, and interrupt or destroy what is being done. But even then, the final result is sure. That was his thing. For unification is a necessity of nature, an inevitable movement. Its necessity for the nations is also clear, for without it, the freedom of the small nations may be at any moment in peril, and the life even of the large and powerful nations insecure. The unification is therefore to the interests of all, and only human imbecility and stupid selfishness can prevent it. But we have plenty of human imbecility and stupid selfishness, I'm afraid. Iski kami nahi hai. But these cannot stand forever against the necessity of nature and the divine will. But an outward basis is not enough. There must grow up an international spirit and outlook. International forms and institutions must appear. Perhaps such developments as dual or multilateral citizenship, willed interchange, or voluntary fusion of cultures. Nationalism will have fulfilled itself and lost its militancy, and would no longer find these things incompatible with self-preservation and the integrality of its outlook. A new spirit of oneness will take hold of the human race. Well, that's of course a highly, idealistic idea, but I think it's worth idea. Frankly, you know what I've come to the conclusion after AI? I've come to the conclusion that the only way we are going to become a global society is when the robots take over the world. Thank you very much. We break for coffee, 11:15, only half an hour. Paune 12 tak wapas aa jaye. Don't disappear, all you young people. Have coffee and come back here.